The biggest unanswered question is, where is the money?
Welcome to Upside, where we dig into the real stories behind the headlines affecting European venture. This week it's Lomax from Outsized, Andrew from 7%, and Mads and myself from Superseed VC. And we're talking markets. Markets up, markets down, markets all around, a little M&A. Oh, and did I say markets? Then we're going biblical with AI Jesus, forgiving thy spying neighbor, healing deals of the week, and Google's going for a whiz. Plus we've got all of the latest in AI Corner, and deals of the week. Guys, what's been happening this week? Andrew, what's been happening with you? Are you good, bad, ugly, indifferent?
I'm amazing.
You are amazing.
Off to Asia
You are
next week. So I've
white,
been prepping for
middle-aged
that.
VC. You are amazing.
Off to Asia, Tokyo, Singapore, and Seoul in 5 days. Never been, so excited to go. And I've been prepping this week.
Lomax, what's been happening with you?
Usual, deals, founders, portfolio. This week was Father's Day in Portugal, called the Dia do Pai. So I got made this little hat by my the best father in the world, Meu Pai do Mundo.
How is your Portuguese?
Está a melhorar. It's getting better. It's getting better.
Okay,
Yeah, I can do restaurants and
Better
cabins.
than yours, Dan. Better than yours or mine.
There you go.
Is the answer.
There you go. Well, land of the one-eyed king. I'm in. I'm sold. Madzadoodle, what's been happening with you?
BYD, they're at it again. They kind of launched the news of the 5-minute battery charge. And that's
nuts.
5 minutes for a 470-kilometer range, they're reporting. Now, Tesla, they have a fast charger already, but it's 275 kilometers in 15 minutes. Mercedes, they've sort of tried to do one better at 325 in 10 minutes, but the BYD offering is just another league. And it's at a level where you can start to compare it to filling your tank.
This is done now, isn't it? That is the holy grail. You are now in the same playing field as an ICE engine.
Yeah, I mean, we just need enough charging stations now, right? I mean, it's just fascinating. So it'll make it even tougher for the European automotive makers to catch up. But I think the good news, kind of the silver lining, is the upside, if you will. It's a big boost for the overall EV industry. And that's exciting, of course.
And in a bad week for Tesla, with nearly all Cybertrucks recalled.
Yes. Yeah, wasn't there a massive core panel that would peel off on the freeway? Wasn't that
It's a panel, yeah. I don't think it's core, but I mean, it's certainly a panel that peels off that they need to replace.
Which you don't want hitting you at 80 miles an hour on the freeway. But we're going to talk about markets, because even that's fairly US centric, there are some very, very strong European angles. So I want to talk a little bit market. Trump has been fiddling around on purpose or not is the debate. Is this a purposeful market flattening, crashing? But there has been some IPO activity, some M&A activity, and it's not just the US. So taking a look at the Klarna IPO to start with. So Klarna has filed a revised F1. So that's the S1 for foreign companies this week in March. The company is aiming for a valuation of 15 billion, aiming to raise over $1 billion. Now that's a third of the valuation of 45 back in 2021. So it's a bit of a step down. However, still seen as an important part of getting the market activity repushing. The IPO should take place in April, hopefully. Klarna listing on the New York Stock Exchange. It was founded in Sweden. However, the top co is a UK PLC. Lovely little European success story. Interesting fact, UK listed companies that move and list in the US don't necessarily do better. Now, it's not a massive data set. There's only a set of 12 companies over the last 10 years. But those that moved, research shows that share price didn't move that much, but liquidity did. Now, Mads, what else is happening on the markets front? Because you've got some other sexy stories in M&A too.
Yeah, I think the wider context is that after 2 years of an exit slowdown, the high-profile exits are really picking up. And we've got these long-awaited IPOs that now finally are happening. You talked about Klarna. We also briefly touched on the CoreWeave IPO, which I'll try and unpack a little bit now. And then we'll look at some of the M&A that's taking place, because it's actually super exciting. So alongside Klarna, CoreWeave is going public either later this month or early April. And it's worth noting that the CoreWeave IPO just over the last few weeks has been reduced in size from $4 billion to $2.5 billion in terms of the capital that they're planning to raise. Markets have been choppier. NASDAQ is down about 11% from the February peak. Now, as a brief recap, so CoreWeave operates data centers, and what they provide is bare metal GPUs to AI developers. So it's different from traditional cloud providers because when you log onto AWS or onto your Google Cloud or Azure, you use virtualization or you access virtual slices of hardware. But with CoreWeave, you can get the whole thing, and that's been super popular, and that's why the business has been growing at an incredible pace. So in 2024, the revenue was $1.9 billion, which is a great basis for going public, you might say. In 2022, it was 16 million. So it's grown from 16 million to nearly 2 billion in 2 years. It's absolutely nuts, and it's all GPU driven as part of this wider AI trend that, of course, we are talking about a lot on the program here. On the M&A side, CoreWeave recently announced the acquisition of the MLOps platform, Weights and Biases, for $1.7 billion. Now, Weights and Biases is a Databricks competitor, and that's also an exciting company. So what we're seeing is this sort of set of kind of almost reverse babushkas where you've got one private company acquiring another private company and then going public. Overall, I'd say that it's a great thing for the ecosystem because we have all this liquidity that is now going to flow through. And then I'd say, lastly, there's a big kahuna that landed this week. And it's so big that it's one for the record books. And I'm talking about Google's acquisition of Wiz, which you alluded to earlier, Dan. Briefly, what is Wiz and why is the deal important? Well, firstly, it's an Israeli cybersecurity outfit, and their specialty is in what they call agentless cloud security. So what does this mean? Well, it's the ability to scan for vulnerabilities without installing agents on every single device, making it much easier to monitor large fleets of tech and networks and servers. They also create a digital twin that can simulate the security posture of your infrastructure setup. Why is the deal important? Well, it's the most valuable M&A deal for a VC-backed private company ever.
Woohoo! Woo!
It's $10 billion more than Meta's acquisition of WhatsApp in 2014, and it's happened in record time. So Wiz made it from kind of founding the business in 2020 up to $700 million of ARR in just 5 years. And then they've exited now at $32 billion on a 45x revenue multiple.
Nice.
So it's an amazing deal. It's Google's largest acquisition ever, more than twice as big as the Motorola acquisition. And it's the highest exit valuation for a cybersecurity company, $4 billion larger than Splunk. So a terrific deal, one of the largest tech deals of all time.
What was the why?
Google is behind AWS and they're behind Azure in terms of cloud size. And they're thinking about inorganic strategies to try and catch up. There's going to be more focus on health, there's going to be more focus on food, and there's going to be more focus on defense and cybersec. Because why? The more important technology it becomes, the more important it becomes to secure that technology. And so this is just seen as an ever-growing area.
But wait a second, guys. The fat lady has not sung yet because the specter of the FTC looms large over this transaction. So we'll all remember the Adobe Figma acquisition, which was blocked by the FTC. And we had been saying in the last few months that the FTC, with Lina Khan gone, has had its wings massively clipped by the Trump administration. But actually, if you look at what's happening, last week, the investigation into Microsoft that was announced under the Biden administration by the FTC confirmed last week that they're going to continue with that antitrust probe, which you would have thought might have been pushed under the rug with the new kind of lighter weight FTC. And for this transaction, the FTC have said that they will scrutinize this, and they've said that they will scrutinize it properly, which means that this deal is not done yet. And actually, Dan, you brought up something interesting last week. You'll remember that in the Figma transaction, there was a $1 billion break fee, which meant that when the deal didn't happen, Adobe paid Figma $1 billion. In this case, the break fee is $3.5 billion. So actually, Wiz, even if this deal doesn't happen, which, it may, if it doesn't, they're going to be $3.5 billion better off on their balance sheet, which is pretty nice.
For a 5-year-old company, thank you very much.
I think basically Google are looking at this, and you can say putting 10% aside as a breakup fee, more than $3 billion, it's generous, maybe we could call it, aggressive, ambitious, especially given the risks that are looming over it. I think they're taking a view, and I think the view they're taking is that where the last administration was quite ideological when it came to antitrust, this administration is very transactional. And I think they are gambling on the Trump administration, yes, putting barriers up, but ultimately acquiescing and doing some kind of deal. And the question, of course, is what is the pound of flesh that Trump and his administration will extract.
By the way, guys, talking about markets, the market hated this deal, right? So Alphabet shares down 3% off the back of it. They're using a third of the cash on their balance sheet. So it's a big bet, and they're buying, as Mad says, at 45 times revenue. They trade at 6 times revenue.
It just feels odd that they didn't do more along the way to kind of mitigate this. It kind of feels like some form of lacking in Google's strategy to need to do this deal. But maybe that's not the right lens. But it just feels like feels a bit hinky.
It's always going to be tricky striking a balance between sort of national sovereign capability or economic interest and just allowing the markets to do their job. And I don't think there's really a clear strategy on this yet. It seems to be, to your point, Dan, seems to be a bit applied a little bit ad hoc. I'm unconvinced that the monopolies and mergers commissions are truly independent in any case. Yeah, it's a challenge.
As Mads mentioned, who's the biggest venture shareholder in Wiz? Index, 12%. European Venture Fund. Who was the biggest shareholder in Figma? I think it was Index. So, two of the biggest M&A transactions in the last 3 to 5 years in venture have been majorly cornerstoned by European VCs. So,
absolutely masterclass.
Loving it. I want to shift gears. I want to talk about Foodome sequencing, a bit of an odd sideways move here. So this is Bryan Johnson from the Don't Die movement fame. He wants to sequence food akin to the human genome. So the background being that it's actually really hard to eat clean. So he wants to start a company that sequences 20% of the food that makes up 80% of the US diet, which apparently isn't just blue Skittles and Mountain Dew, I'm told. So question for the room, and probably Lomax, this is one to lean on you for, is will this make a difference? Is there a place now for startups to focus, or elsewhere in this kind of longevity space focusing on food? And do you think within our lifetime, here's a question for the whole room, do you think within our lifetime we will raise a generation of kids that will live forever? So Lomax, can you kick this one off?
Okay, lots to unpack. Let's start with food. So we talked about it before, and I know Andrew has a big bugbear about this, and I'm sure we'll chime in later. We know that we have a massively fucked food system, particularly in the US. We have 42% of Americans are now clinically obese, and 50% are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. That's 50%. Now, the numbers are lower in Europe, but, if we don't watch it, we could be heading in the same direction. So we know that we have structural problems in the food industry. Now, the problem is from a startup perspective, in a way, we've actually had a bit of an experiment here to see the kind of concept that Bryan Johnson is talking about, like sequencing food, or whether it's actually sequencing food, whether it's actually profiling food, whether it's better information. I have no doubt that all of this is necessary. We have a startup in the UK called Zoe, which has raised a lot of money with hundreds of thousands of subscribers. However, one thing interesting about it is the churn rate at Zoe is huge. Yes. From what we can glean publicly, it's around 50% of users churn within 9 months.
But that makes sense, because you get your month's worth of data, you learn which foods spike blood sugars, and then you go, great, why would I stay?
To be honest, when it comes to food, like 90% of it is just common sense. It's like drink less alcohol, eat less sugar, eat more greens, eat less volume, eat less ultra processed food. So in a way, it's a very, very simple, right? But that's a very hard message to get across at the population level. I personally am a bit like, I struggle to see, looking at the Zoe example and thinking about Bryan Johnson doing a very expensive sequencing of lots of food and trying to sell that information data in a kind of consumer subscription app. I'm not convinced that that's like a major success story. One thing that I think actually does move the needle on food is our dear friend regulation, which is something that we do. And, we talk about Europe being good at regulating, etc. I think in America, they've been asleep at the wheel here. There's a complete conflict of interest between the food companies and the population health. I'm sorry, it's just very, very clear that they are optimizing for profit. And we also know that big food, is a very small group of companies that operate not a monopoly clearly, but it's an oligopoly effectively. There's massive regulatory capture by those companies. In the UK, you can see small examples. So in 2018, we introduced a sugar tax, which levied a tax on the amount of sugar in soft drinks. So we've actually seen quite interesting data off the back of that. Obesity rates in year 6 girls in one test came down by 20%. So this is preventing 10,000 cases of obesity, in the UK alone within that cohort, which is phenomenal. So actually, not only that also raises money for the exchequer. Now, maybe only 500 million, but that's still something, particularly in the context of what's going on in the UK at the moment.
Yeah,
so
but that doesn't take into account the other side. So the things that aren't going on in the health service because of that So surely there's an offset there.
Of course, exactly.
Between...
Yeah, obesity rates, the comorbidities from obesity, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I'm a bit skeptical about the Bryan Johnson thing. Sure, he'll get some subscribers. I wouldn't back it as a VC. I love it that he might do it, and if he wants to raise private money and have a go, then for sure that's great. But I think actually to move the needle at the population level, interventions by governments, quite frankly, is the biggest, quickest needle mover.
Andrew, what was your bugbear?
I've got a few about food.
I've got a few. It might take some time.
I think there are three things here. There's the food we choose to eat, the food available to us to eat, and then how we eat it. And so if we think about the food we choose to eat, eating well is, I think, relatively easy, but people either don't want to or they don't know how to. So they're either not educated on why the food they eat is a problem, or they just don't care and they live in ignorance. As you say, Lomax, all the way from sugar ratios in food to levels of fat or ingredients. And I actually have a very dim view of the food industry globally. The only reason Europe is any better is because of some of the regulations. All food companies are interested in maximizing profit. There's no real thought to the health of the consumer unless you happen to be working in a niche or working towards selling healthier food because you think that's going to increase your profit margins. That's just the nature of capitalism. And so regulation, unfortunately, is something we really should lean on. The food available to eat, my second point, is one of the biggest challenges because even healthy food now, and I think this is the Foodome issue that Bryan Johnson talks about, and I actually think it's an amazing idea, is because of the way food is packaged and processed and washed and transported, a lot of it is infected, if you like, with microplastics and other chemicals we don't know about. So even if you go and buy an organic tomato, it might have sort of over 20 different types of sugar, 300 different flavonoid molecules, 50 different antioxidants, but also trace pesticide residue, microplastics. And you think you've got a healthy organic tomato, but actually you're eating stuff which 5,000 years ago you wouldn't be consuming. And that's got to be having a fundamental effect on human health. Dublin University did a piece of research where billions of microparticles of plastics went into then the cup of tea that you're drinking. How is that legal? I think we'll find out that cancers and other things can be rooted back to the microplastics we're consuming. And then the third point around how we eat it is stuff we can change. I have spinach and eggs for breakfast. But I was told off for microwaving the spinach in the bag because when the plastic of the spinach bag heats up to a certain temperature, it releases microplastics. So everything we eat is, the plastic we use to stir boiling water, the Teflon on the frying pans, if it's scratched or if it's heated to above a certain temperature, starts to degrade and releases chemicals into the food.
Forever chemicals.
There is a big question. Why are any of these things legal? When we know these facts. So what do we do about it?
Foodome sequencing will be very interesting. And in a way, to be honest, the people who should be using that data is the regulator to make decisions. I mean, one of the big problems with food is at the population level, I think people vote with their pocket. I'm probably going to wake up in 20 years' time and we'll realize that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been incredibly damaging.
I have no doubt that all of these things, plus all the digital form radiation, the pollution, the way that our food is processed, packed and distributed, are going to conflate to some pretty serious health conditions and on fertility and on stuff that we haven't even considered yet.
Dan, it's interesting if you turn it on its head and said, what if it wasn't a legal requirement to list ingredients in food? The answer is companies would not bother to list the ingredients in food. If it wasn't a legal requirement to list the nutritional value, companies wouldn't bother because they have no interest in doing so. The first step is transparency from the businesses because I don't have time to go and pick fresh food if I can find it in a field. I do have to go to a supermarket. So therefore, let's at least make it possible for them to make good decisions.
The ultra-processed food, the messaging around that has been landing. Again, I don't know how much it's landing at the population level, but sorry?
Has it made a difference? This is the challenge, is that I think you nailed it. It's like if you poverty line, what are you going to do? You're just going to feed the kids with whatever your turkey twiddlers, whatever you can get wrapped in plastic and cyanide. You just need to get, so you got a $5 as your budget. What are you going to do?
That's totally it. I think the way I'd say UPF, if I look at some of these plant-based startups, right, which have all gone bust in the last 18, 24 months, a lot of that has been like consumer pushback against the amount of ultra-processed ingredients they have in order to kind of recreate the meat flavor, for example, in plant-based meat. So you can kind of see that. And did you see M&S in Marks and Spencer in the UK, the kind of posh supermarket, released these like new cereals that came out last week or the week before? So they released a box of cornflakes, and on it they have a very simplified packaging, and it just says one ingredient, corn. And then it has the equivalent of Cocoa Pops. And it's like 4 ingredients, like corn, oats, cocoa flour, and something else.
And they all taste like shit.
They all taste like shit.
But it's worse. Corn is not good for breakfast.
Corn is not good. And also,
we're fighting against generations of the food pyramid, which was released, and then endorsed by the United States Department of Agriculture, produced for the food industry, because those carbs, those grains were cheap. And so it's told, eat loads of these things. We're not designed to eat loads of those things. Actually, animal fats and other stuff should be the thing you eat most of, not corns and not cornflakes in the morning. Product with very little nutritional value that all turns into sugar that you can feed to kids and sell billions of boxes of. Well done, Kellogg's. It's actually criminal. Yeah, and the worst thing is, most Western countries are top of the food pyramid when there was, just because the US did. And we've been teaching this thing for decades, and it's pure BS.
Gents, here's the question for the room. Where is the opportunity for startups? Because all of this is mind shift stuff and culture stuff, but I've got to bring it back to the point of the pod, which is, what do startups do? What do investors do? Is there a place to play, or is it just a regulation tip?
Going back to Zoe, the startup that sort of measures your biome. I mean, first of all, there are some question marks over how much analysis of your poop really does provide efficacy, because the biome of the intestines and the stomach is so complex, we're still trying to unravel it. And some of those measurements, and then they tell you what you should change, are not always accurate. I'm sure there's some great stuff that comes out of it, but one of the reasons people might be dropping off, if they are Lomax, is that you've got to be able to affect change. And the question we always ask the founders, how are you going to make this sticky? Because unless you can affect some change, both emotionally and practically with the user, they're going to drop off. If I get my biome sequence and all this information, what simple steps as a consumer can I take to then see an outcome where I improve? And I think that's really challenging. You've always got to take it through to an emotional outcome for the user.
But I think in terms of opportunities, I'm an investor in various food tech companies, right? I still think, even though it's gone through, we talked about here a bit of a bear market in the last 24 months, I'm still long-term bullish on that, partly for the reasons we talked about, the health impacts, right? But also there's the global impact. We know that roughly a quarter of agricultural land is dedicated to developing feedstock to feed to animals, which we then kill and eat. So it's a hugely inefficient food system, right? Both from a kind of cost, supply chain, and environmental footprint. So I'm long-term bullish on, in Europe we have Meatable Gourmet, Hoxton Farms, etc. They have, in the UK, you have a whole bunch of other, Impossible Foods, etc., etc. So startups working to recalibrate and reset the global food system for sure. But for the reasons we've said, huge incumbents, massive incumbents. And I think price is the biggest differentiator at the population level. So there's a lot of things to work through in order for those to be big billion-dollar returns. No one's going to argue the TAM, and no one's going to argue with how essential it is. So I'm long-term bullish on food tech if done in the right way.
Mads, food tech.
Let's take a step back. Where are some of the challenges in this? I think it's easy for us to say we should regulate more, but I think short-term, the challenge is that with regulation will come price increases, and food inflation is just the last thing we can afford. The truth is, the modern food industrial complex has been excellent at shipping lots of very cheap calories to our populations, which may not keep them healthy, but it keeps them alive. And so I think there's sort of a twin track we have to explore, right? And on one hand, how can we make sure we increase the food safety standards while also finding whole new ways of making food that can enable us to create cheap food that is also healthy? And that's not an easy thing to do. I think some investments, you've made some investments, Lomax. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is how can you fundamentally re-engineer the plants? How can you re-engineer the biology so that it can produce more and better, whole foods with less pesticides in more adverse conditions? And maybe that kind of avenue will lead to the types of results we need. But I don't think there is one clear, easy way. I think there's some real trade-offs and real challenges one has to work through. Just as a complete aside, did you guys see some of the results from Bryan Johnson's hyperbaric oxygen treatment?
No. I've only just started watching the Netflix series. I've not seen. I've only got halfway through episode 1.
I've not paid any attention to the Netflix stuff, but I saw in the last few days where he was talking about this, flooding himself with oxygen, right? Kind of these highly pressurized oxygen containers. And, from what I could see at a high level, the results were just astounding. So not easy for everybody to do, but Lomax, I guess, especially with all your insight into health, if it's something you had looked into, because it looked truly astounding in terms of the cell rejuvenation.
What was it? It was pushing oxygen into the cells? What was it doing?
Yeah, so the idea is you go into a chamber that has almost pure oxygen and is pressured. So you push more oxygen into the body and you sit in this. You can work in this, right? If you sit in there for an hour, you can do your work. But as you get all this oxygen in, the oxygen triggers cells to basically become younger, de-age and rejuvenate and become better.
His news that it was undergoing shock therapy or shock treatment. I'm not sure what type of shock treatment, because it gives him more nighttime erections, which is apparently directly correlates to health. I thought that was a more interesting bit of news.
Which is totally counter to why cornflakes was invented in the first place. If anyone wants to look that up, I won't raise why.
Oh, that's a major. I'm interested in that segue.
Are you seeing? I mean, one thing living in Lisbon, where people are very, very into this kind of thing. I mean, there's now like a longevity clinic on every street corner.
Is there?
And, yeah, it's very interesting. Is that happening in London? Are you seeing that?
No, not yet.
Okay, I think
what do you do there?
So you do, some of them have hyperbaric chambers. You do cold ice baths. You do infrared saunas, all that kind of stuff. They
don't just shove spinach down your face. They don't walk in and you're
not so focused on diet, to be honest. IV infusions for vitamin C and Myers cocktail and zinc and that kind of thing. So I think that's becoming. They're expensive and they only target a very small portion of the population, but that is a high value healthcare service in a way, consumerized as a business. I mean, not necessarily venture backable, but certainly very interesting. I mean, I think just wrapping up on Bryan Johnson, I think yes, this is, as Matt said, there's all this stuff that if you invest lots of money in and time, you can do, but actually it's very, very simple, a lot of this. And actually Bryan Johnson's, his biggest thing is sleep. It's literally it.
Yes.
I think if you get 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night, you're golden. And that's
How is your sleep, Lomax? Do you sleep well?
Having stayed up late last night to prepare for this podcast, no.
Mads, do you sleep well? Do you sleep? Are you good at sleeping?
Sometimes.
Okay. Andrew, are you good at sleeping? Andrew, can you get your solid 8 hours?
My biggest problem is getting to sleep. It takes me half an hour to an hour to get to sleep. So if I can get to sleep, I don't know. On average, I'm in bed for an hour to an hour and a half longer than I sleep, which is pretty inefficient.
I don't sleep. And the older I'm getting, the less I sleep. And I'm now anxious about it. I've got an Oura ring to track. I get no deep sleep. And I know this is damaging. I know that I'm not performing well.
Because then you get sleep anxiety.
Yes. I'm now trying to go to bed earlier to counter, just to try and relax and turn all the blue light things off. And
I've tried audiobooks work well. If you get an audiobook with a nice narrator, I put that timer on and I listen to that going to sleep sometimes, and that actually takes me somewhere else, helps switch my brain off.
Not the upside.
I have a segue in.
Stephen Fry does, which is go to the kitchen and make mayonnaise. Apparently, did anyone see this?
That's a strategy if ever I heard one.
You go.
I don't.
Fryonnaise, he calls it.
But I think on Bryan Johnson, I think sleep is a needle mover, right? And sleep and diet, and also just giving up alcohol, for example, like drinking less. All this it's very, very simple. One of the more enlightening things, apart from all the science that Bryan Johnson has said, is that when he started this process, he said his biggest enemy is 7 p.m. Bryan. Is the Bryan that was making decisions at 7 p.m. about food. Yes. Whether it was going to the shop to buy food, ordering online,
it's sugar or salt. Yeah.
And I think about that in the context of my day. It's like, that's when I make the worst decisions around food, is between, say, 5 and 7 p.m. And I bet you that's the same with a lot of people.
I bet he'll just be run over by a bus at 38 or something. I have no idea how to segue this into AI Corner, Mads. So I'm just going to sing at you. This is AI Corner. And we've got AI Jesus. We've got NVIDIA's new chips. We've got a Stargate competitor. And then you're going to tie it all back to Europe. So Mads, over to you, my good man.
Yes, so much happening. Stargate, will recall, is this maybe $100 billion, maybe $500 billion, depending on who you ask and how much you squint when you look at the program. What's exciting about it is that it's been moving extremely quickly. The first data center is already taking shape. First 2 buildings have already been built, with 6 more planned from the first data center. So 8 in total. And the capacity that's planned here is 400,000 GPUs. So 4 times the Colossus, or the Colossus's launch capacity, which has previously been the largest facility. So Sam Altman, OpenAI are going all in on Stargate. But Elon Musk is not one to be outdone.
Of course he is. Of course he is.
This is where all the exciting shenanigans are taking place. You asked about Netflix earlier. I don't know who's got time to watch Netflix with so much excitement happening in AI space. It's better than any sitcom or any soap, I promise you. Now, while Microsoft, will recall, used to be the largest backer of OpenAI. But while OpenAI now have new friends in SoftBank, Microsoft is getting closer to Elon Musk and xAI. And they're now working on initially a $30 billion data center project. They're also working with MGX out of the UAE and with BlackRock. And the new group is called the AI Infrastructure Partnership, or AIP. So it's not quite as evocative as Stargate, and the numbers are also a little bit smaller, but they could bring in other investors. They are mooting, pushing it up to $100 billion. And so this is kind of Musk's attempt at trying to get back at Sam Altman and saying, well, you got your 400,000 GPUs and you're a Stargate. Well, I've got my 100 billion. I've got my friends here. In parallel, xAI is reportedly looking to raise another 10 billion. And so clearly the AI wars are running hot. And it was the NVIDIA GTC this week, the GPU tech conference. AI Jesus, Jensen Huang himself, he kicked it off with a 2-hour keynote there where he was announcing some cool new chips, the Blackwell Ultra, the Vera Rubin, and the Feynman to come in 2028. Now, the schedule looks a little bit tight that they want to release Vera Rubin already in 2026, and we know that Blackwell was delayed. So, but I think the big takeaway is that Wang, he said that scaling laws are not slowing down, and the computation that's required will keep growing because what? Because of reasoning and agentic AI. And he's basically saying the workloads that they're seeing and expect to continue to see from reasoning and agentic AI means that the amount of tokens, the amount of maths that are required to be pumped through these GPUs will be at least 100 times more than we thought we needed just a year ago. He is bullish and the industry is bullish, and so much still happening. Do you want to tie it back to Europe
this
now?
though, Mads? Well, the other thing that always every time I hear these stories, every time I hear about the data center stuff, every time I hear about AI, I always wonder how we're going to power it. I always wonder where the energy is going to come from. It just feels like, I think last stats were data centers were about 1% of energy draw in the US, but it just feels like this is going to need, we're almost going to need nuclear power plants next to these
That's actually a very
things.
good point, by the way, Dan, because actually I was reading this week, the European Data Center Association, sexy organization,
sounds super
released
sexy.
its 2025 State of European Data Centers. And the biggest takeaway from that was that operators, the 75%, this is European, right? 75% of operators, their primary concern for data centers was access to energy and electricity. So that is absolutely critical and key. And did you know, I was reading this the other day, that Dublin is in Ireland, 20% of the electricity used by the grid is used in data centers. 20%, that's growing to 30%. Really? So nearly a third of the whole energy usage or electricity used in the whole country is given over to data centers, right? And Mads has talked about this before, like we have this chronic problem of energy costs in Europe for reasons we don't need to go into now, but we've gone into in the past, geopolitical reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And that ties intrinsically, as you said, Dan, into this. And we're seeing this as a major problem in the sense that it's not in the US. Like we don't want to talk about more problems in Europe than we have in the US, but certainly this is a major blocker.
But what else is going on in Europe? What's the European angle on all this?
Well, the French were quick. So Macron, he came out a few weeks ago and said, listen, I see your initiative. I've got my Le Français initiative. So 100 billion plus there for AI infrastructure. And of course, Mistral is going to be a key part of that. They've said we're going to invest billions to build our own AI data centers in France.
Is this a pivot, do you think? Is this Mistral going, we need a little bit of a hedge or a pivot?
I don't know if it's a pivot. I almost think it's back to the original mission. There were sort of discussions a few months ago about whether they would pivot out of being a model developer and into being more of an application developer because it was so hard to compete. And I think what Trump has done is basically reminded everybody that although, we sometimes think of ourselves as one big happy family in the West, the US is not Europe, and maybe it is sensible to have what people sometimes call sovereign AI. And so I think to some extent, this almost reinforces Mistral's initial raison d'etre, which was to be kind of the French AI or the European AI model. And that then begs the question, does it make sense to think about this as going head to head with the frontier labs in the US? Is Mistral ever going to be able to catch up with the Anthropics and the OpenAIs and the xAIs of this world? Or is it really a roadmap to something else? And I think if you think about it, game theoretically, you've got what we've often said is where we think the ultimate value will accrue is in the application layer. And it's quite possible that having foundational AI that's good enough that it can power the AI apps we need will be all we need. Now, Mistral's latest model was just 24 billion parameters and is said to perform as well as GPT-4o Mini, which is the workhorse of OpenAI right now. So if the fear is that at some point, maybe from a defense perspective, right, we've seen in Ukraine, the Americans are saying, look, we'll switch off intelligence, maybe we'll switch off Starlink, do all these unspeakable things. Well, if we have technology that's good enough, it might not be the best of the best of the best, but if it's 98 or 99% of the way there, it might be good enough to power the AI workloads we need on the app side. And that may be all that's required from a European strategic side. And then you build a lot of great applications on top of that. So I thought that was sort of an interesting perspective.
We have to try and compete. AI is so fundamental to our future. You have to try and compete. Great question as to whether in this generation of AI, they'll be able to. But we don't really have a choice. I also think we're going to see...
But Andrew, so unpack the question a bit. The models of this year are far better than they were a year ago and 2 years ago, et cetera. Are you going to asymptote enough that it's fine to be, you might be at 99%, the 99.5% of the frontier model?
I think it depends on the application. If you're using your LLM to automatically generate sales responses, 5%, 10%, 15% difference in efficacy or quality of your automated email that's written by an LLM probably makes no difference. If the foundational technology makes the difference between having an AGI or having next gen, what do they call it? Super AI, whatever these labels keep changing, then I think it really does matter. So there is a question about whether one focuses on the next step change technologies. And I think we've lost this current battle with today's, what's on the shelf today. You're not going to catch up because we probably don't have the money by the looks of things, but there is a whole bunch of technology coming down the pipe which could really change the game for us. And there are chip startups. There's going to be other AI technology that comes out, which hopefully usurps what there is today. And we should focus on that. We should focus on the longer game. We should focus on the true frontier technology, not just play catch up. It's almost as if sometimes in Europe, we look at what's going on in the US and we go, oh, we need that. And then we desperately try and catch up and copy. And you've seen it again and again in new markets being developed. You saw it with Uber. And then suddenly the taxi startup in London got funded because the US VCs had backed something that looked like it was going to be successful in the US. So it is up to us. It's up to the VCs to put our money where our mouth is and have the courage of our convictions and back that next generation technology and plow our own path. What is the problem we're trying to solve in the world and find ways to solve it? Not just, oh, the problem is we don't have an LLM like OpenAI. Let's go and try and copy them and go and build one. That's what the Chinese do. We're better than that. We should go and invent our own future.
But with DeepSeek, they I mean, who knows what went on behind the scenes, but they looked at what was being done. They used the best of the best, and then they did add, tweak, and they incremented. So it feels like that could be the European angle, especially on the application side, where use the best of the best and then build for you on top.
We're not at a situation yet where if you turn AI off, you turn OpenAI off, the economy collapses, but we will be. And so we need to think a little bit strategically. We need to think a little bit further ahead to the technologies we'll need when AI, if you don't have it or it can be turned off, your economy stops working and infrastructure stops working.
I don't agree, Andrew. I think it'll become so commoditized. I think such a level of smart will become so commoditized that if it's not OpenAI, it'll be Anthropic. If it's not Anthropic, it'll be somebody else. I just don't buy the argument.
But it's a more existential question around whether you believe it's a problem for a friendly nation, in quotes, like America, to have a critical level of control over your economy or your data or your weapon systems. Because right now, if America went bad, really bad, they could
worse than it is now,
trash all our economies. Well, I think you block Gmail, you even block access to the internet, you block satellite comms, you block GPS. All our economies collapse today. So that's the existential question we're wrestling with, that Europe has to wrestle. Is this just rhetoric because it's politically sensible to say these things to balance out the geopolitical game, or do we really believe that actually we need to be able to do this stuff independently, either at a European level or at a national sovereign level? Do we really believe that? Which is it? Is this just smoke and mirrors, or foundationally, like, actually, do we need our own cloud? Do we need to be in control of our weapon system supply chain? Do we need to be in control of the future AI, which will control the planet? It'll be, some of AI will be commoditized for sure, Dan, but it will also be ubiquitous, and some of it will be critical to the future of everything. In the same way that right now you turn the internet off, your economy's fucked. Completely.
If you follow that logic, so you can't turn the internet off, right? That's the beauty of it. It's decentralized. But if you follow the logic of your argument, should we then also create?
You could disrupt the internet.
Sorry. Should you create a rival mobile operating system? Should we? I mean, do we replicate everything?
Well, Android's open source. It's very hard to turn it off.
Lots of AI is open source.
Absolutely. So there's you can argue that that's fine because you can use an open source, run it locally, and you're fine. So that's great. There's a counter argument to that. But really, what you're saying there is, yes, we do need to be sovereign independent as either a state or as a union in Europe. But the solution is open source AI.
I think there's such a blend. We're bunching in such a blend of challenges here. I love the fact that Europe has woken up. To what degree, an argument for another day. I think there is enough going on across Europe to be invigorated to create some solutions to some of the challenges that the Trump administration is posing around defense. We have some incredible military and defense supply lines, Switzerland, Norway. There's some incredible defense contractors that can build incredible stuff. France is really good at it. The UK is not bad at it. Anyway, a bit of an unusual one. The last up was something that caught my eye recently, was this kind of startup espionage topic, which this week we've seen Rippling suing Deal. We've seen Flexport suing 2 ex-employees for stealing source code and starting a new business. I think it was Freightmate, I think it was. So all became very public. I have no doubt all of this kind of stuff goes on behind the scenes, whether it is at a country level, a company level, or a startup level. I think it was fairly recently, you will remember that the Giggle leaker, how Elon Musk caught the Tesla secrets leaker to the press. He found them by changing emails, and he put the word giggle in one of the emails that then found all the espionage going on at Tesla. Samsung and LG had a very public physical altercation at a German electronics show over washing machines. Waymo's co-founder Anthony Lewandowski stole company secrets set of his own firm. He was caught with a file on his laptop saying Waymo confidential, which kind of brought him down. He went to jail. I think he only did 6 months inside in the end after an 18-month sentence. So the old Andy Grove quote, "Only the paranoid survive," the ex-Intel founding team member from Intel, "Only the paranoid survive" kind of came to mind. But any stories from your past or in portfolios? Maybe Andrew, you'd want to kick this one off?
You're asking me to open the kimono.
Go on, you can Chatham House it, or you can. There's got to be some stories where there's been some espionage or some sneaky surreptitious behavior.
I think as businesses get more successful, you always see bad actors for sure. I mean, I was kicked out of my own company. I was engineered out of one of my own startups, so it doesn't get much more espionage than that than stabbed in the back. But for sure, large startups have large war chests because they end up needing them for lawyers, and lawyers make hay. So yeah, there's been a whole bunch of situations over the years that we've seen, all the way from employees leaving and stealing IP to employees leaving disgruntled and trying to take down the company or the business owner through employment tribunals or crazy claims. And we've actually had portfolio companies blow up because in some cases those claims were true and the co-founders were doing things they shouldn't be doing. But in this day and age of smear and social media, it is pretty easy to cause startups and CEOs a lot of pain, even with no evidence. So yeah, it gets dirty and difficult, right?
I think what caught my eye was the fact that these things are going public. We all know in this room there's lots of stuff that goes on that never becomes public, but it feels like there's obviously some reasons, or maybe somebody got caught out or something. There's a little bit of a PR game going on. But Lomax, have you got any stories for us?
I've got stories of like fraud and deceit and deception and all that kind of stuff. I've got, people stealing money and that stuff across the portfolios at times, or companies I've been involved with. On the kind of more sexy espionage side, I would say we had one, I'll try and not give too many details, but a company in healthcare services where the founder was bribing or paying a nurse who worked for a rival to get information about that company. He actually got found out by the regulator and struck off. That was an interesting one. I think where this stuff does happen, those kind of things are all exceptional. You might think they never happen to you, but they might happen indirectly to something that you're involved with somewhere, and they do happen from time to time. But I think where this actually happens like more commonly is, founders or people's employees spinning out and setting up their own company. And that happens the whole time. And we know we have like IP protections and you have restrictive covenants, etc., depending on the seniority of them. But that's something where the gray zone is a little bit more pronounced, I'd say, and in terms of, they're taking they are complete insiders in a industry player or an up-and-coming industry player, and they're coming out and setting up their own rival, right? But that becomes a very gray area, quite frankly.
Yeah, you can't stop. You can't remove what somebody has in their head, can you? You can't remove the knowledge of a CTO or an operator.
Correct.
You've got to split know-how from IP. How do you do that?
Yeah, and also the opportunity cost is just like, what's the point in like waging war on these people, for example? But I think the Rippling deal one is fascinating because that is really cloak and dagger stuff.
I've seen so many, and also it wasn't the accountant, it was an auditor or something. It was like the non-sexiest, non-spy, the one thing that you think is the function that there's not going to be any characters that he would even think like this. Mads, have you got any espionage stories from your career?
I could tell you, but I have to kill you.
Kill you. Okay.
I got one. I remember I had a new business phone call. I was running an IT services business late 90s, and I got a phone call from a new piece of business. So I was like, great, I'll come and see you and we'll talk about whatever you wanted to do. And I got taken to an underground bunker underneath Pimlico tube station, where I was escorted into this kind of, if any of you have been to a high security facility, you get kind of taken into this kind of room, which is like no windows, no doors. So they asked me to leave my phone and my watch and any kind of metallic objects. And I got taken into a room, and it was MI5. And what had happened was I'd done an installation for a private security company that had somehow been infiltrated by the CCP. And they thought that I was part of the crew that put the bugs on the machines of the private security company. And I did, and it was...
I always knew you had a dark
maybe
past,
you were.
Dan. I always knew there was something dodgy about you.
Well, that goes without saying, but it was almost the Pixar lamp in the face. And I was in this grey room with this guy, a really lovely guy. He was obviously the good cop. And they were asking me all these questions. It only took about an hour for them to realise that I had nothing to do with it. But I started absolutely losing my shit because like this is now becoming quite scary. But MI5 and MI6 are not where you think they are. They're not the James Bond building, that super sexy thing. I think it's gone now, isn't it? On the side of the Thames. All the cool stuff goes on underneath Pimlico. Just putting it out there if you wanna look up the spies. Gentlemen.
Actually, by the way, you mentioned Lewandowski. You know what happened to him? You said his prison sentence was shorter. He got pardoned by Trump.
Yes.
So the lesson goes is Trump will let you get away with this stuff, Yeah,
I'd love to know why. I'd love to know. Yeah.
Well, that must be, yeah.
I mean, anywho, gents, lovely chatting, and we'll catch you next time.